Hi there. So in the beginning, there were knots. Knots show up everywhere in nature and in our culture. And the purpose of this lecture is to just show you a few instances of this with the hope that you'll start seeing knots everywhere you go. And then towards the end of the lecture, we'll connect it back to the mathematical theory of knots. So knots really do show up all over the place. The photo on the top left is a knot that just accidentally formed in the cord of my headset on a flight to Japan a few years ago. The image in the lower left is of a fence in Matsumoto Castle in Japan, and you can see the wires twisting around themselves there. It forms a pattern that that shows up in some knots that appeared in a research paper of mine, along with some collaborators. These are knots that had some pretty cool properties. Probably my favorite example of a knot in nature is the knotted hagfish. So I'm going to show you a quick video here of the hagfish, so you can have some sense of what it's like.
I've thought that those spots were its eyes, but it's obviously it's not. It just appears to be.
Oh.
So you can see the hagfish tying itself into a knot.
Oh, wow.
Oh, no, wow.
Okay, so that is the knotted hagfish. Apparently, the reason that the hagfish ties itself into knots is that it is covered in slime, and it sometimes has to clean the slime off of itself, and so it ties. It wipes the slime off. Apparently also they don't have a lower jaw, and so sometimes they'll use the knot that they tie in their bodies as essentially as a lower jaw. So the top of the jaw will come down and bite on whatever it's eating using the knot as the lower jaw. So at a tinier level, knots show up in chemistry and biology. DNA is an incredibly long polymer, and it can get tied up into knots, and there are these enzymes that come in and help get rid of the knotting and tangling. Chemists will also sometimes try to synthesize molecules into certain shapes, because it's not just the atoms and the bonds between the atoms that give a molecule its properties. It's also how the molecule sits in space. And so knotted molecules can have different properties than non-knotted molecules. Theoretical chemists and synthetic chemists like to try to devise new ways of creating molecules. And there were these three chemists, Castle, Evans, and Hyde, who proposed these new structures, new chemical structures. And they say in their paper that we came across this new method of edge entanglement that we call ravels. But then after they had finished their work, they discovered that mathematicians had already been studying these structures from a mathematical point of view, but not the chemical point of view. Knots also show up in several places in physics. One neat application was that for a few years, some people thought that the universe, our three-dimensional universe, might actually be this particular kind of space called the Poincare dodecahedral space. And one of the best methods of describing what the dodecahedral space actually is in terms of something called surgery on a link or on knots. So we'll get to that later in the semester. There's something else from statistical mechanics called the Ising model, and this is connected to some of the knot invariants that we'll discuss later in this semester as well, where you keep track of sort of all possible states, and you're summing some quantity over all possible states of a particular kind of system. Knots also show up in craftwork. The objects on the top left are called Japanese knot baskets. I took that photo at a museum down in southern Maine a couple of years ago, right before my trip to Japan. And you can see that the wood in slats there are bent and woven in and out of each other, forming these knotted patterns. On the lower right, that's an office of an object in my office called the, it's made out of soapstone. It's the trefoil knot, and it was made by a Kenyan craftsperson. You can see in that it casts a shadow, and these shadows, along with the information of sort of what's in front and what's behind, are called knot diagrams, and they're going to be a key tool for us this semester. So there's this compendium of knots called the Ashley Book of Knots that was put together in the late 19th century by this guy, Clifford Ashley, who had been a whaler. So his job had been to go out and hunt whales. And he got obsessed with knots. And so he went all around the country and probably the world collecting examples of knots from different kinds of professions. And you can see a couple pages from the book here. It's a really remarkable collection. A lot of the writing is very witty and clever. Unfortunately, parts of it are marred by some pretty awful racism too. So definitely not all peaches and cream there. And if we're tempted to sort of turn up our noses a bit at the craftsmanship of knotting, might help us to discover that actually physicists and engineers are starting to take knotting really seriously as a method that might produce interesting materials. Knots also show up in art. There's the Celtic knots, which are pretty famous. The photos on the top two photos on the right there are photos I took of Celtic knots appearing on tombstones in Ireland. Leonardo da Vinci also was interested in knots. You can see a couple illustrations of depictions of Leonardo's knots there. The book Leonardo's Knots by Carolyn Cacciadori argues that, in fact, you might be able to use Leonardo's knot work as a method of authenticating or de-authenticating works that you may or may not think were painted by Leonardo. Knots also show up in contemporary art. Two of my favorite pieces are the one on the left there, and then the piece entitled Coffer Unknot, second version by James Sienna. There's a piece in our own museum here at Colby, In Blue by Terry Winters, that was inspired by pictures of knots. We'll read about that later in the semester. And then there's a sculptor, Helmut Ferguson, who's been highly influenced by mathematics of all different kinds and has made knotted sculptures as well. Knots also show up around the world in different kinds of design and symbolism. So some of the oldest examples are runestones from Viking Sweden. You can see them here. The photo on the left I took in Oxford this past year when I visited the Ashmolean. The photo on the right is from the Ashmolean's website. So these runestones were used to convey either religious imagery or were methods of sort of declaring power for a particular chieftain. But knots show up, oh yeah, there's the endless knot of Buddhism. It appears in a variety of Buddhist cultures. I took that picture from Wikipedia there, but all the other ones here are different kinds of graphic design inspired by knots. So you can see the Alaska Rug Company, reef knots, those are inspired by sort of nautical imagery. Companies that make ties love to use knot imagery. Sometimes knots are used to depict a particularly difficult problem, like they are for the no-D solutions there. Various kinds of churches use knots. There's the photo on the top right is from Trinity Reformed Church in my hometown of Orange City, Iowa. And you can see the knot there with the blue, red, and green. And I like that because it's an example of coloring a knot, which is something we're going to talk about in a little bit. And then there's this company I think it's in Israel, called the Knot Studio, that makes these giant knot pillows. which I think are really fantastic. There, in high-end design, Virginia Sin's group has made use of knots. You can see one made of terracotta there. And then Wendy Xian became, I think, well known for her project entitled Year of Knots. And what she did was every day for an entire year, she learned to tie a new knot, and she turned it into artwork. And what she says is that I approached the Year of Knots as an assignment I gave myself each day to learn a new knot. The seed of the idea was simple: self-education. I had no idea, but by the end of the year, I'd have a single artwork comprising more than 300 knots that stood on its own, nor that I have honed and owned my voice as an artist. That all happened as I was learning a new knot every day for a year. Knots have also shown up in TV. Portlandia season 2 includes the artisanal knot store. If you haven't watched it, I encourage you to find it on YouTube. It's only about 3 minutes long, but knots play an important role there. So these are all places where knots appear in culture and in nature, but what about in math? So the first appearance of knots in math is probably in the work of Gauss, some unpublished work. And Gauss really made two contributions to what would later become knot theory. He invented what we call Gauss diagrams, which are ways of representing knots. And then he was also the first to define linking number, which he defined as a certain kind of integral. So we won't see the integral formulation of it, but we'll certainly be working with linking number. The next, Gauss had a couple students who worked on various things connected to knots, but really the next place they started to make a big impact was when Lord Kelvin, William Thomson, was thinking about the fundamental attributes of nature. So it was in the 19th century when people weren't really sure what matter was made of. And there was a debate. People knew that matter had certain kinds of continuous properties, but one of the most popular theories was the atomic theory of nature. And they wondered how discrete objects could actually give rise to continuous properties. And so Kelvin thought that he had the answer. He said that maybe in fact we don't have individual things called atoms, but maybe what makes up all of matter are knots in the ether, which was basically believed to be this sort of invisible fluid-like thing that filled up all of space. And Helmholtz had discovered that in something like the ether, you could have vortex motions. So you could have movement like through this liquid or a gas, ether. You could have movement through this substance that formed knots. And Kelvin suggested that maybe knots were actually the fundamental what gave rise to the fundamental properties of nature, rather than atoms. Of course, that turned out to be wrong. In fact, we no longer believe that ether exists because we've looked for it and can't find it. But so people picked up, so Listing was the student of Gauss's, and then Tate picked up on Kelvin's ideas and began the process of making tables of knots, trying to list all possible knots. This was developed by Kirkman. And then as we enter into the 20th century, a number of other people made really important contributions. So Poincaré was really a person who gave rise to the interface between geometry and topology. And it turns out that many of Poincaré's ideas have really beautiful representations in knots. Poul Hegard and Max Dane wrote the first really survey article or encyclopedia article on topology, and they both made important contributions to knots. Then knot theory really started to enter into its own through the work of Dane, Wertinger, Reidemeister, and Artin, and we'll see all these names again. Many of these guys were German mathematicians. Hegard was Danish and Poincaré was French, but Dane and Wertinger and Reidemeister Artin were German. And if you look at the dates, you realize they're practicing at they're mathematicians at a very difficult time in the world. And Dane had to flee Germany under the Nazis and had a very dramatic escape across Siberia. Reidemeister was fired from his position as university professor because his wife was Jewish. Artin ended up coming to the United States. In the United States, we have these other knot theorists. James Alexander and Ralph Fox made really important connections between knot theory and topology and geometry. The notion of coloring a knot, which we'll see quite soon, is due to Fox picking up on ideas from Vertinger. Papakyriakopoulos was a Greek mathematician who worked at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and he proved something called Dane's lemma. Max Dane, you'll recall, he was on the other slide, had suggested a way of characterizing the unknot. We'll come to in a bit in terms of like the unknot, something is not knotted if it bounds a disk. And Papakyriakopoulos made a fundamental connection between that and algebra. And then, I thought about trying to continue to make slides and just became overwhelmed with the number of people over the years that have worked in knot theory and made contributions to it. And I want to stress, and we'll see this as the semester continues, that nowadays knot theory is truly international. There are many Japanese knot theorists, Mexican knot theorists of all, probably all possible nationalities, lots of men and women working in knot theory who've made really important fundamental contributions to the subject. And we'll encounter some of them as the semester goes on. Within mathematics, knot theory is connected to a whole bunch of things. I've already mentioned geometry and topology. It's also connected to differential equations. So Richard Paris, in this old article from the 70s, showed that, in fact, differential equations can have solutions that produce knots. And then knot theory is also closely connected to the Poincare conjecture, which we'll explain at some point. And that was eventually solved by Gregory Perelman using methods from differential equations. Knot theory is also connected to complex analysis, and it's connected to theoretical computer science too, and actually very applied computer science. So there are computer programs that can calculate all kinds of things for knots. We'll use some of them this semester. Here's one called SNAPy. There are lots of very interesting questions, computational kinds of questions about knot theory too, which we'll encounter. So just to end here, I want to emphasize that knot theory draws on lots of different math, algebra, combinatorics, geometry, topology, differential equations, number theory, computer science theory, complex analysis, applied math. We'll see applications to biology and physics and chemistry. So hopefully this semester you'll find something that's really of interest to you and you'll be able to explore it. Awesome. Talk to you soon.